Welcome back to the Christmas countdown. We are telling the woke version of Rudolph. It's called Rudolph the Nasally Empowered Reindeer. We have lots of art from Milkshake yet again. I don't even know if you get to see them on this video. If not, you'll get to see them in the next one. But let's begin. Rudolph the Nasally Empowered Reindeer. The story of Rudolph is a familiar one to most of the pre-adults in America and other parts of the Western world. Not that this fact is an endorsement of Western culture, just an acknowledgement that the publicity and merchandising machines run more efficiently in those areas. While the image of an early young reindeer cheerfully giving his all for Santa Claus might be useful to department stores and jingle writers, the truth of his story is more complicated. It's true that from birth, Rudolph was a unique individual, that his luminescent olfactory organ made him different from, but not inferior to, the other reindeer in his age category. And they often maliciously taunted him about his supranasal capabilities. Some reindeer caregivers, concerned that his nose has resulted from radioactive fallout or was somehow contagious, warned their fawns not to play with him. What is not true is that Rudolph was disappointed to be so ostracized. While his parents successfully fought to have him schooled alongside the other young bucks and does, Rudolph always fancied himself an outsider. In fact, he worked to cultivate his image as an angry young reindeer. He had no interest in the other reindeer and their inane games. He took himself and his fluorescent gifts seriously and was convinced he had a higher calling in his life to improve the fortunes of the working reindeer and overthrow the oppressive tyranny of Santa Claus. For untold years, the success of Santa's toy-making monopoly depended on the co-option and exploitation of both the reindeer and elf populations. To this end, his most important criteria for the reindeer on his team were strong legs, a 10-point rack, and minimal gray matter. The fact that he only recruited bucks for his team and excluded the does is cause for more outrage. Santa insisted it was to protect the morale of the enlisted bucks, but unfortunately, in Rudolph's time, the does were still awaiting their liberatrix. To Santa, Rudolph was one of the Northland's most dangerous creatures, a reindeer with a brain. He had seen a few during his years at the pole, but there was something about Rudolph that made him especially nervous. It might have been the deer's standoffish attitude, or the rumors that he was organizing meetings with the other reindeer late at night. Santa also sensed a charisma in Rudolph that, if not kept in proper check, might disrupt his tidy little enterprise. And so it was, on that fabled foggy evening, Phantom found himself in a bind. Harsh weather conditions left him unable to exploit the aerodynamic talents of his team. He had, of course, flown them through all sorts of dangerous weather before, with no thought to the reindeer's physical strain or mental trauma. But on this night, the weather was so tempestuous that the bearded slave driver was fearful for his own safety and for the insurance headaches that a crash at his own toy works would certainly create. Although Santa had known for years about Rudolph's gifts for incandescent dissemination, he had not called special attention to it. In due time, Santa selfishly calculated a use for it would arise, and until then there was no need to tip off how valuable Rudolph's skill might prove to be. That moment had finally arrived. On that foggy night he sought out Rudolph among the herd, and, wearing his humblest and most pleading face, asked him, "Rudolph, with your nose so bright, won't you guide my sleigh tonight?" The young reindeer looked him over carefully. After a few moments of silence, he said, "No." Santa blinked a few times and repeated, "No?" The herd could scarcely believe its ears as well. "No, not without concessions," replied the creature, who happened to be antlered. "The days when we jump every time you whistle are over." "What are you talking about, concessions?" blustered Santa, who hadn't planned on this twist. "This is your big break, your chance to join the team. This is the life's dream of every young reindeer." Rudolph laughed. "This is starting to sound like A Star is Born. Next you're going to tell me, 'Kid, you're going out there a nervous young buck, but you're coming back a star.'" The herd all chuckled at this remark. Perhaps such a gung-ho speech was all too familiar to them. Santa reddened, realizing he'd made a tactical error in approaching this young firebrand in public. He said, "It's cold out here. Why don't we talk this over inside my chalet? I have some very good moss and lichens, just picked." "I'll eat what everyone else eats," countered Rudolph. "And whatever you have to say to me, you can say out here." The other reindeer were watching this face-off with great interest. For years, they had treated Rudolph with suspicion for all his bold ideas, but now he was bravely sticking up for them at the expense of his own career. Some shouted encouragement, while the more reactionary deer grumbled about not rocking the kayak. Santa began to feel some pressure as the minutes ticked away and the fog grew thicker. Finally, he asked Rudolph what his demands were. "You work the reindeer too hard, with no consideration for our families," Rudolph said. "We want a guarantee of no work on holidays." For the next 30 minutes, Santa tried to explain the disadvantages of this idea. The main one being, of course, that the reindeer only worked one night a year anyway, and since that night always fell on a holiday, such a change would make their job and his rather difficult to fulfill. Rudolph eventually agreed to table the issue for the time being. Checking his watch, Santa was starting to sweat, even in the Arctic cold. "Could we speed this up?" he asked. "Or maybe forge a temporary working agreement that we can make permanent after Christmas?" Rudolph snorted in his face. "We weren't born yesterday, Claus. No contract, no flight. If Christmas doesn't come this year, who do you think the children will blame? The reindeer? The weather? The Interstate Commerce Commission? No, they'll blame the overfed guy in the red suit." Santa imagined the public relations headache this would cause him, and his frame began to sag. Rudolph grilled him on such issues as health care, paternity leave, profit sharing, and joint decision making councils. As the fog refused to lift and the minutes ticked away, Santa granted more and more of the deer's demands. In the end, Rudolph and the reindeer, rank and file, could claim a number of victories. The deer would be acquired to fly only one night a year, and after 4 hours on the job, they would receive a 90-minute dinner break and three 15-minute breaks. Santa was required to keep 4 alternate reindeer on standby for the duration of Christmas Eve at full pay and benefits. In addition, the mandatory retirement age was lowered to 8 years, after which the reindeer were to receive a full pension and lifetime health care. After all the terms were finalized, an exhausted but relieved Santa Claus hitched Rudolph up with the rest of the team. The other deer gave Rudolph 3 cheers for standing up for their rights against the man, which the nasally empowered reindeer, feeling fulfilled for the first time, gratefully accepted. Using his unique luminescent gift, he led the sleigh through the inhospitable weather, and Christmas that year was saved. We also have an epilogue in this story. Like the fabled prophet in his own land, however, Rudolph found his real influence evaporating soon after that. For weeks he was praised by all the other reindeer, who told him, "You'll go down in history/herstory." All the attention and admiration, however, began to feel superficial and distracting. Rudolph felt that any lionization of him would take energy away from the continuing fight for the well-being of the working reindeer. In a facile attempt to emulate their new hero, the other young reindeers began to wear bright red coverings on their noses. While Rudolph expressed his displeasure with this, some muttered that he was becoming too humorless and doctrinaire. To Rudolph, the first agreement with Santa was to be just the beginning. He envisioned an eventual creation of a working reindeer's paradise, a toy making and distribution collective where the means of production were shared by everyone. Unfortunately, many of the other reindeer began to take their newly won benefits as their inviolable right bestowed by nature. They grew fat on too much moss and complained about their improved work schedules were still too taxing. Factions began to form among them about the best way to invest their new pension fund. Rudolph tried to convince the dissident deer that they needed to stand united, but they began to resent his holier than thou attitude. Some spread the rumor that he was an agent provocateur, sent by other aeronautical gifted animals seeking to gain Santa's favor and put the deer out of their jobs. While such theories were patently absurd, they served to discredit Rudolph and emboldened his detractors. Eventually, he was voted out of the union he had helped establish. After this indignity, Rudolph decided to strike off for Lapland, where he felt the undomesticated reindeer were more in control of their own future. And so, like other revolutionaries before him, Rudolph the angry young reindeer lived out the rest of his days in exile, bitterly wondering how a movement with such promise could prove to be so fragile in the end. That's all we have. We have some other art, but I'm going to wait for tomorrow's story to share that. And that's it for our woke Rudolph story